I come across a field that is enormously multifaceted. And in its multifaceted nature, you have a whole set of artistic practices, you have a whole set of cultural production and meaning making that go into constituting a field. And when you start thinking about the way canons start dictating the field, or canons start being read upon the field, that narrows down the idea of practice to a huge extent. And so, in a lot of research that I've been doing, I've been fascinated by the fact that a lot of artists who were poets, who were theorists, who were teachers, who were travelers, who did all kinds of things in their life as artists, start to narrow down a definition of art based on a certain idea of a canon, which is only about making paintings, or making sculptures, or making installations, and all of those other things. It's not like they don't continue to happen. It's just that they get cast somewhere else in some other trajectories. So my feeling is, with regard to the canon, it has to be received from ground up. One has to read them from ground up. How is a set of practices reading into a canon? How does it then start absorbing the canon? And how does that start reflecting in the field? And so if one were to treat it the other way around, in a canon and how it dictates cultural production, it might end up being a narrative which is either derivative, or how someone was inspired by a canon from somewhere else. Whereas if you start looking from ground up, you find a much more rich practice. And you start seeing what kind of meaning makings are at play here. I could also give an example, for instance, when looking at, say, mid-20th century art magazines from various languages, it's baffling how many references to Picassos and Van Goghs there are, which sort of planted a certain idea of what modern art is, or what a modern artist is. And this modern artist is either a tragic figure, a bohemian, an eccentric recluse, a very isolated island of sorts, who is facing or bearing or reflecting the brunt of the world. And if one reads from that narrative of a canon and its relationship with the field, there's of course that side of it. But then, as I was saying, if you start looking deeper into a practice or into a set of practices, you find a lot more diverse set of references. Like I said in my previous answer, my feeling about exploring the field via its practices is something that I find difficult to identify with seismic moments. And I would look much more for lateral associations, nodes of practices, nodes of conversations, trajectories of travel and mobilization. I would look much more at that rather than defining moments that affected the field. I think we're in a time where we need narratives like those far more than path-breaking events which then change the course of cultural production. Because if you start selecting those path-breaking events, you end up only looking at those practices that kind of respond to it. And I've often asked myself this, that if, for instance, the partition history of South Asia has been such an important moment in mid-20th century that kind of overlap with, say, the Second World War, what kind of art history would get written if you don't have enough practices of that time that are addressing the partition? And of course, it doesn't have to be that artists are representing the partition, but if there are no artworks, or if there's a rarity of artworks that literally address the partition, then it's one kind of story. But if you don't have those artworks, then you just wonder what kind of art history is going to get written. Is it going to be about lacunae? The way I've been approaching research projects at Asia Art Archive have been, like I said, they're not so much to do with seismic moments, but of identifying a time period where artists mobilized, had taken on certain things. And I'll give an example from a project I was doing in Baroda. It's called the Baroda Archives, and it's already online with more and more documents going up. And in a project like that, what you have is not a seismic moment that that defined the narrative or that set the terms for how people are going to practice, but how artists took upon themselves to build institutions, to imagine different futures of the art, and they imagined those and executed them via different curriculums that they were proposing, via a re-exploration of tradition, via what one might identify as a movement called the living traditions. And so when you look at these kind of trajectories that artists are pursuing, it's really about what ideas they're mobilizing, what kind of communities that they're forming, and it's not really centered around a seismic moment that everyone had to then respond to. And I think that's where I'm coming from about this. The contemporary art scene as we inhabit it today, in the information age, in a time when the boom and bust have already happened in the art market, when financial crises and all of these has translated not just in the economic world, but into all forms of cultural production and stuff, in global warming and all kinds of crises. Basically, the contemporary moment is completely unresolved. It is a time when disciplines and categories are colliding into each other, merging, questioning each other, questioning themselves. When you have a moment like that, how much has the modern art field shaped it? I can't quite say, because I feel, and I find it very exciting, that the contemporary moment really questions all of those categories, all of those classifications that include the modern. And so I think that projects which actually interrogate practices beyond just an artist making paintings is something that is possible in the contemporary moment without any qualms about, how does someone's writing poetry really inform art history? Or how does reading of literature shape our understanding of modern art? These kind of things, I think, in the contemporary moment pry open the history of modern art. So I think the term global and international are not exclusive of each other. They signify very different sets of processes and relationships to the world and to oneself. And when it comes to the global, I think it has a lot to do with a certain circulation of capital and certain circulation of values which tend to have a homogenizing kind of force. So in the way recent art has been discussed in terms of globalization, it is to identify a circuit of contemporary art that is global. It is to identify a set of practices and a set of styles and a set of media which kind of had a homogenizing effect about itself. That a region should represent either a region but speak a certain language, all of those things. And I think that is not something that has replaced the international. The flows of capital, the flows of information that globalization brings can coexist with internationalist kind of ideologies. And therefore, what I would think about internationalism and the way it has existed for the longest time are far more, are far more agonistic in their relationships. In two different regions or two different, nations, because it's international, are on the one hand defining themselves and therefore identifying what kind of relationship they should have with another nation state or region. Well, I think the Museum of Modern Art has stood for certain values and certain trajectories in art history. And I think one way that the Museum of Modern Art could contribute best is by enriching those trajectories and not necessarily feeling obliged to take on entirely different trajectories, because there are so many trajectories emerging now in our understanding about art history. So in providing a more richer, a more textured trajectory that it has been pursuing would be an interesting way to see that it is a school of thought, just like several other schools of thought. So MoMA is being true to itself by standing by that school of thought.